Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first lesson in a new series on the subject for GCSE history for AQA on America between 1840 and 1895, expansion and consolidation. Now, I'm releasing these videos. The first video here is early May, on the sort of 13th of May. So for those of you who are watching this right now, who have an exam in a few days' time, this isn't going to be particularly helpful for you because I'm not going to be able to get all of these lessons out in time. But this is going to be more aimed towards and geared towards future years. So this is recording and being made in 2025. For those of you who are studying this topic in a later time period, this should be a lot more beneficial to you than it is to anybody else. Now, this lesson specifically is going to take an introduction to one of the most important issues in the 1840s for the Americas, this being the Great Plains and the idea of manifest destiny. We shall talk about manifest destiny in more detail in the next lesson from an ideological, practical, and consequential perspective. This video is going to spend more of our time focusing on the geography of the Great American Desert. This was as part of our understanding of the specification to understand the attitude towards the Great American Desert. Now, the term Great American Desert refers to the vast arid regions in the west of the United States, including parts of what are now the Great Plains, which is what is traditionally understood, as well as the Colorado Plateau and the Great Basin. These attitudes varied among different groups of people, from explorers, the attitudes by explorers, attitudes by settlers, attitudes by scientists, politicians, and indigenous populations have to also be taken into account. So, from a geographical perspective, the idea of a Great American Desert is largely influenced by the exploration and scientific surveys of the early 19th century. Even though we begin our conversation in the 1840s, I want us to just jump a little bit further back to the 1820s, when we see a number of expeditions and the role that is played in those expeditions. So, for example, in 1823, we get the expedition of Stephen Long. Now, Long's expedition plays a pivotal role in shaping the perception of the Great American Desert. Essentially, Long, upon travelling through the Great Plains, describes the region as a desert due to its lack of trees, its extreme climate, and its very dry soil. His reports are then published in 1823, and it stated that the area was inhospitable for agriculture, and so as a result of which was largely unfit for settlement, for expansion, for colonization. And so what this did was essentially emphasize the barrenness and the harshness of the region and help to solidify the notion that the Great Plains were a desolate and unproductive land. This portrayal was heavily criticized, but was influenced by many American attitudes towards did influence, should I say, many Americans' attitudes towards the region. And it marked the beginning of a widespread belief in the desert-like nature of the area. Now, early maps often depict large portions of the western US as just a big old desert, with little understanding of its potential for farming and for development. This is a perception that would persist for much of the 19th century, despite contradictory evidence coming from explorers and settlers who are basically saying, look, we are settling in this area. It is more hospitable than some of the scientific expeditions suggested that it was. And so when we get to the 1840s, the United States was, by all accounts, expanding westward, and it was driven by this ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that America's destiny spread across the continent. While the idea of the Great American Desert was still widespread, it did not stop American politicians and settlers from trying to push westward. The desire for land and the desire for resources and the expansion of the notion of manifest destiny and the further expansion of the nation of the US outweighed the scientific, the expedition, and the environmental concerns about the nature of the Great American Desert as being allegedly inhospitable. So we do see harsh conditions. It should be noted that the expeditions of people like Stephen Long in the 1820s were not completely false. There was very much harsh conditions in the western side of the United States, but the land was still seen as valuable, particularly for agriculture. And we can see later on something that we will talk about in future lessons, the Homestead Act, which had its roots in these attitudes towards the value of the Great American Plains. Lawmakers believed that settlers could eventually, quote-unquote, tame the land, regardless of its perceived harshness. And we do start to see a number of both ideological conditions that brings the Americans to settle further and further west, as well as the practical implications associated with such settlement. The first is, of course, the 1840s concept of manifest destiny. Like I said, this is something we're going to touch on in this lesson, and we'll talk about in far more detail in future lessons. The desire for westward expansion through this belief in manifest destiny created a political push to conquer and to settle areas that was traditionally believed to be uninhabitable, inhospitable, desert lands that were unable to be tamed, unable to be farmed, and all these different kinds of things. And although explorers and scientists declared the land to be a desert, the dream of expansion still motivated many settlers to journey into these areas. The Oregon Trail, which was something that passed through the Great Plains, also occurred in the 1540s, along with the Mormon migration, which was headed towards Utah. Both of these migrations demonstrated that people were willing to brave the so-called desert in the idea of the promise of land and opportunity, again contradicting the scientific perception of the land as a total wasteland, as settlers had to adapt to the environment in quite innovative kinds of ways. And throughout all of this, we can see that there are, of course, one of the things that we have to remember at all points when thinking about settler colonialism is that indigenous peoples are living in these areas that are supposedly inhospitable and are supposedly ripe environments for taming and for settlement. So you have a number of different indigenous groups, such as the Lakota peoples, the Cheney peoples, and the Pawnee peoples, all having a very deep understanding of the land and its resources. Now, to them, the desert was not a barren wasteland, as you can probably imagine, but to them, it was a region that provided food and shelter and cultural significance. Their attitude then towards the land was centered on this idea of sustainable use. And so for the indigenous peoples who already lived there, the Great Plains was a place of rich biodiversity, and for many, it was a place of great spiritual importance. Groups like the Lakota people developed highly influential and important ways to adapt to the ways of life on the plains and to the environment. The importance of buffalo hunting and sort of nomadic living was something that was very much important. We'll talk about the importance of the buffalo in future videos. This demonstrated a different understanding of the region compared to the sort of Western colonizing Euro-American view of it as a so-called barren wasteland. Such events then would often cause conflict with settlers. Whenever there's settler colonialism, there's always conflict. That's naturally one of the things that happens. The migration of settlers and the federal government's push for westward expansion would lead to increased conflict with indigenous peoples, as their traditional view of the ways of life were disrupted. These tensions were exacerbated by the belief that the land was uninhabitable for settlers, yet it was a home for indigenous people who had lived there for many, many centuries. And so when we think about the sort of cultural views towards westward expansion, the cultural perception of the American West began to shift. Early reports of the Great Plains and the desert-like areas were, of course, negative. But as the settlers continued to move further and further westward, and new cultural narratives would start to emerge, and these new cultural narratives would emerge to emphasize and to challenge the idea of the traditional understanding and to present opportunities for the taming of the wilderness. In literature, then, we can see writers start to romanticize the idea of the American frontier, framing it as a place for adventure and untapped potential. Authors like, for example, James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote about the American frontier in works like The Last of the Mohicans in 1826, people like this helped to shape the image of the American West and challenge the idea of the traditional understanding of westward expansion. Romanticizing the view of the West was at odds with the earlier scientific depictions of it as a desert. The 1840s also marked the beginning of a more optimistic view regarding the potential for agriculture on the Great Plains, and this is partially because of the fact that we see a greater amount of technological optimism. The idea of that technological advancements could overcome the perceived limitations started to take root in the general psyche of the Euro-American settler. The construction of irrigation systems, the use of new tools, and advances in crop cultivation would slowly begin to shift the public opinion towards westward expansion. And we start to see things like, for example, the invention of the steel plough in 1837, just ever so slightly before our period of study, invented by John Deere, who essentially was able to help settlers break the tough and dry soil of the Great Plains, which was seen as traditionally impossible to cultivate. These kinds of technological advancements would continue to shift the attitudes towards the Great American Desert. And we'll talk in the next lesson about the idea of manifest destiny and the belief in manifest destiny as we start to think about the growing numbers of people who would start to expand their territory westward. We'll talk about the Mormons, we'll talk about miners, we'll talk about the idea of the permanent Indian frontier and the Native Americans as way of life that had traditionally been disrupted by this expansion of settlers into this new region.